Claire will do her presentation, and then right after the presentation, we have two very, very short announcements to make, and then we'll get into questions. So for the questions, please put your questions into, do we have a Q&A button at the bottom?
We don't. We just have a chat button this time.
Okay, so please put your questions into chat. And if you could, it would be a great favor for me if you would put at the beginning of that, highlight it with question. So I will be able to pick out what the questions are. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we will, we'll do the best we can. We'll try to answer as many as possible and then get back to you later. This program is being live streamed, and we will send you the video with some information on it afterwards. So that said, while we are presenting, if you could all turn your mics off, and we're ready to get started. Claire Schaeffer-Duffy. Well, first of all, Claire Schaeffer-Duffy is a new member of the Mass Peace Action Board. Very pleased and proud to have her be a part of that. She is a member of the St. Francis and Teresa Catholic Worker in Worcester, Massachusetts. She is a freelance journalist, program director for the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. And she has done this incredible trip. Claire, I first heard about this trip, was months ago. And when I first heard about it, I thought, this is an impossible task to go to Zaporizhzhia. But then I remembered, Claire, I first met you, in person at World Fellowship a few summers ago, and I got a book written by Scott Schaeffer-Duffy on Nothing is Impossible. So surely what you are doing and what you have done and what you bring to us is the thought that nothing is impossible and that we need to come together and we need to do all that we can to work for peace. Here in Mass Peace Action, a few months ago, we had a program on the dangers of Zaporizhzhia. So we are so pleased and so happy to have you here tonight to give us a firsthand view of what you saw and what your thinking is about it. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everybody. And I'm so glad that Charles Johnson, who was one of the team members on the trip to Ukraine, is here tonight. I don't know if my other team members are. I can't quite see who entered the room. Let's begin. I am going to provide in these opening slides some information on the plant that I hope is not redundant for those of you who attended the presentation a few months ago about the Zaporizhzhia Protection Plant. This is a story or a report that features a very dangerous locale, a locale that provides perhaps a unique opportunity for bringing about a cessation of hostilities, at least in one area of Ukraine. And the next several slides or more that I'll be presenting to you are talking about that dangerous locale, the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. And I want to credit Dr. John Ruhr, who was also on the team, for the information provided in these subsequent slides. So here's a grand view of the plant. It's located in the southern region of Ukraine, a country that has a north-south river called the Dnipro, kind of like our Mississippi, cutting through it. You can see that blue line there. And in the southern section of the country, the river itself has become a line of demarcation for the war. So these are, the red is roughly Russian-controlled area, and the white, of course, is the rest of Ukraine. And as you can see, Zaporizhzhia sits there in the south, one of 5 nuclear power plants that are in the country. And if I can figure out how to get rid of my pen now, excuse me, I'm gonna do this. This is an aerial view. The plant sits on the southern bank of the Dnipro River, which is now under Russian control. And in a wide portion, there's a reservoir. Nuclear power plants require a lot of water. This was a constructed pool water for cooling the plant. The plant is in this area here. The pink dots that you see are the plant's 6 reactors. They are currently in shutdown mode. They've been in shutdown mode since last fall. One is running hot to provide some power for the plant. So a few facts about Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, which is in the oblast, meaning district of Zaporizhzhia. It began operating between 1984 and 95. It is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It has 6 reactors that produce 20% of Ukraine's electricity. The reactors are not the primary source of concern. At the moment, it's the waste, the nuclear waste that has accumulated over nearly 40 years of the plant's operation. It was run by Energoatom, which is the Ukrainian energy company. The Russians are currently there, and it's Rosatom that is running the plant at the present moment. The on site, there are pools that are used to cool the radioactive waste, and this is the crucial and worrisome detail regarding the plant because of the amount of waste, tons and tons of radioactive waste that require being constantly cooled by water. Water running over it, and to keep that operation going requires electricity itself, much of it provided by external power lines to the plant. Some of the risks that have made this such a vulnerable and volatile place is the obvious one is that the Russians, after their invasion in 2022, they seized the plant very early in the war on March 4th. And in September, the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors they had been very, very worried about the state of the plant, but observed multiple problems. And it was in September that Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, called for creating a safe zone, a nuclear safe or protection zone around the plant. A month later, Russia declared the lower third of the Zaporizhzhia district where the plant lies as part of the Russian Federation, complicating the situation even more. Here on this slide, we're listing January 26th as the last major shelling, but certainly exchange of fire is happening in the vicinity. Even since then, there was some shelling April 8th while we were there, although we weren't aware of it. And I have read of reports of areas near the plant being mined. So this is a photo of a shell strike that damaged the roof of one of the areas where the nuclear waste is kept. And the plant has been, a source of great concern, especially for Rafael Grossi, and to just give a sense of the danger that this plant poses. As one point of comparison, we could think about Chernobyl, which is one of the 5 power plants in Ukraine. This one is no longer in operation, and it, infamously had its meltdown in 1987 due to human error and actually poor construction of the plant. But as a result of that meltdown, the exclusionary zone that was created from radioactive contamination is about 1,000 square miles. So that means that area is not habitable by human beings. And if ZNPP, the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, were to have a war-related disaster or accident, that exclusionary zone would be 6 times that space. And what's important to note in the story of this plant is that Chernobyl was predominantly in a rural area, but the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant sits in a highly populated area, close within 80 miles of the city of Zaporizhzhia, which has a population of 1 million. There are 200 industries there. So this is a highly industrial, highly peopled area of Ukraine where the plant is or was operating. This slide, which I cannot show you in the video form, but it provided a simulation of the contamination that would spread should there be an accident in Zaporizhzhia. So here we are in Ukraine. Zaporizhzhia is down here. This was a Ukrainian hydrometeorological institute simulation, and they showed the radioactive plumes, some of them heading to the east, but a cloud pouring over into parts of Western Europe. Interestingly, since seeing this map that John located, I came across a report by an American institute studying this exact question of where would radioactive air spread occur. And this study did different predictions according to wind directions and circumstances for each of the equinoxes of the year. None of it was good. If you're not a technical person or scientific person like myself, the primary takeaway here is that the plant is a regional problem. It's a regional hazard. So how dangerous? Besides the comparison to Chernobyl, we might think of the Nagasaki bomb that many of us are familiar with. It had about 15 pounds of plutonium. 85% of that contributed to the initial energy that killed 50,000 Japanese on that first, in the immediate aftermath of its detonation, which was aerial. But the remaining 15% left radioactive contamination that killed an additional 20,000 people over decades. So we know that the harm from any nuclear material is not limited to the moment, but continues generationally. And according to Oleg Bodrov, a Russian physicist engineer, some of you may know him through the International Peace Bureau, and he has been a voice opposing this war. He estimates that approximately 50 tons of plutonium have accumulated at the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant and is there being stored as spent fuel, and that this could produce 50,000 times more than the mass of radioactive contamination after explosion in Nagasaki. One observer noted that if World War II had happened in Europe of today, Europe that's now peppered with nuclear power plants, the area would be uninhabitable. Many of you who are avid readers of the news have heard of Rafael Grossi and his continual calls to address the vulnerability of the plant. Just today, he tweeted out that for the 7th time in a row, the external power lines, all of them were down, and the plant was working on emergency generators. This is Gutierrez of the UN again saying that any damage to this plant is suicide. Rafael Grossi sought to get inspectors to the plant, and this was a remarkable achievement from a negotiation perspective. You know, we hear so much that you can't negotiate with Russia, you can't negotiate with Putin. However, Grossi did succeed in September to getting access for IAEA monitors to go in and inspect the plant on a rotating basis. They are, I think the agency is sending in teams of 2 people, but this does mean that they're going through Russian-controlled territory. They are, you know, being granted access, even though the agency itself has said that the plant, you know, belongs to Ukraine. For all of his efforts, Grossi has not been able to realize a safety zone. Originally, he wanted 30 kilometers around the facility, no fire, to maintain its integrity. His efforts really captured the imagination of Dr. John Ruhr. Some of you may know him. I don't know if John's on this call. If he is, hello. But John is a retired emergency room physician, and he serves on the board of the international organization World Beyond War. He is on it?
Yes.
Oh dear, I'm more self-conscious. All right, well, John and Charles and whoever else is on the team, correct me afterwards. But John was really captivated by Rafael Grossi's success, and he thought, in his own words, that it was kind of a miracle that here were these unarmed technicians and physicians getting access to a war zone for the sake of protecting their human beings. And they had no training in unarmed civilian protection. So what would it look like for trained people in that discipline? And so John's original proposal, which I think was conceived with David Hartzog, was to support and amplify the effort of these inspectors by providing them protection through with unarmed civilians, or and also, if possible, if getting a large enough group of people to create a that 30-kilometer no-fire zone or nuclear protection zone that Grossi desired. So it was a wild ambition and simultaneously a very specific ambition in the context of a war of many parts. So what is unarmed civilian protection, which is the main skill that would be applied, nonviolent skill or strategy in this context? It refers to unarmed people protecting civilians in violent conflicts. It works before, during, and after conflicts, but mostly during, which makes UCP, as it's often referred to, unique in the peace and human rights field. I am new to learning its possibilities, so anyone on the call, you know, in our conversation later, we can speak more on it. But its application that some of you may be familiar with has been in the most well-known is through Nonviolent Peace Force, which is the largest international organization using UCP around the world in places of conflict. It's also, and this is the form that I'm most familiar with, has been used to protect human rights defenders and actually climate defenders through providing internationals who are unarmed to accompany people under threat because of their activism any of you involved in the wars in Central America are familiar with Peace Brigade and their efforts to really experiment with this tactic, often to good effect. It's also used in a public health framework for helping to cure violence presented more as a disease. So unarmed civilian protection would be a way to mitigate that disease through dissipating rumors, through helping, de-escalation of conflict before it becomes contagious. For several months, the Zaporizhzhia Protection Project, as it came to be called, because it was a concept last fall, but starting in January, John and Charles Johnson and just a remarkably dedicated team began offering trainings in the skills of UCP with the intention of perhaps providing this cohort of international volunteers, Americans, people from different corners of the globe. By March, it was decided that, perhaps it was time to go to Ukraine itself to investigate these possibilities. So 4 of us went as a team. And here we are traveling from Baltimore, Warsaw, and Kyiv. I have to say this journey was not for the faint of frame because it required a lot of train and bus hopping since the Kyiv airport is down and we were traveling across the country to the east. The mission of the team was to just go and hear what Ukrainians living in the proximity of the plant, what their concerns were about the risk that the plant posed, what were their ideas about the community providing its own protection. So this is an interesting aspect of this strategy, that it really seeks to give local communities a lot of agency. And it's remarkable that it's attempting to do that in a war context. So our early days were spent in Kyiv, negotiating our arrangements. Our intended itinerary was to take us to the town of Marganets, which I'll show you later on the map, very close to the plant. But that required a lot of planning, and we could not have done it without Yuri Shilazhenko, who many of you have met as the primary voice for the Ukrainian pacifist movement. And he introduced us to a wonderful couple also interested in nonviolent approaches. And so it was a bit of itinerary planning and nonviolent education that happened in those early days. And then I should say in April, where we were in Kyiv, there was not obvious evidence of the war. The coffee shops were bustling, the Apple store was open, people were out on the streets. But as we moved, that has since changed. Many of you are aware there's been a lot of missile attacks on the city that have been thwarted. But as you moved east, you saw more soldiers heading, towards the direction of the war front. And here's a photo of some of them in the city of Dnipro, which sits along the Dnipro River. And it was there that we connected for a morning with Pastor Sergei Vivchar, who was just charming and such an engaging young man. And he took us around his native city, which interestingly, during the Soviet era was closed off to foreigners because it was engaged in weapon construction. I think they built rockets in Dnipro. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall and, the opening up of Ukraine, Sergei told us that many missionaries came in and, there's a kind of flooding of proselytizing, but the city has the largest Jewish cultural center, which we were shown. We were shown the development along the waterfront, some of it quite lovely. And we were also taken to the apartment buildings that were sliced by a Russian missile one afternoon in January and killed 42 people. In the words of Sergei, we were shocked because of the hour, because of the locale. And it was a sobering exposure to just how deeply intimate the ravages of war are. You could see people's breakfast dishes and blankets spilling out of the windows still. And a sign denouncing the Russian action, which to me is a reminder that war devastates the international order. It's both deeply personal and has these global ramifications. Sergei was just one of many faith leaders that we met. He's pastor of Church of the Ark. It's an independent Protestant sect and very fervent in his efforts. The war really upended his daily life, his married life. His wife and family are safe in England, and much of his time in the fall was spent doing humanitarian missions, running to the front. And now even in his pastoral efforts, the city that he lives in, half of its native residents have fled, and it is one of those entry points for residents who have fled the fighting from the east. And as he put it, every Sunday, a new set of congregants in addition to his core. So this makes for unusual work as an evangelist, but he is very dedicated. And though he had great distrust of the Russians, they are liars, he said, he was curious about the project, about its questions concerning what are the safety protocols in Dnipro. He said, honestly, I don't know that, we never thought about the plant being risky all these years, but now we do. And the bomb shelters, I think, for the city during the Soviet period were in the basements of the schools. And these are not well maintained. And so he was provoked and curious with the questions, and also very grateful that internationals had come so far out of concern for the people of Dnipro. From Dnipro, we went on to Zaporizhzhia, a city of many industries and quite poor in some areas. These are just some street images that I took on my final day there, in between rushing around to try to get the train. But it was there that we had back-to-back interviews in the Hotel Teatralny. And these were arranged for us by a Basilian nun named Sister Lucia. And literally from 9:30 in the morning until 5, we sat with residents of the city of Enerhodar, which is adjacent to the nuclear power plant, and who had fled now to Zaporizhzhia. We interviewed a soldier, we interviewed a journalist, we interviewed a pastor. Over the course of the 2 weeks that our team, like half of us left earlier. I was actually in country only a week and probably spoke to 22 people formally and informally in interviews. But John and Charles, Peter and I left early, but John and Charles had opportunity to speak to over 30, which was remarkable because when we left the US, we really had only a couple of people as contacts. So this project was an example of winging it as you go, and we've learned from that since. Because of security reasons, we're not showing you a lot of the people that we met, but certainly these were two of the more public figures, Alexander Pavlov on the far left, who was translator and journalist, print journalist mostly, although he did television. And then one of the city's more well-known radio journalists, Olha Vakola. And So Alexander worked as our translator, wonderful, wonderful man. And here's Sister Lucia. One of the stories that came out in those interviews in Zaporizhzhia was the tale of civilian resistance in the city of Enerhodar. And this city is flush up against the power plant. It's where many of the employees at the plant live. And those who fled the city told us about the 1 week of resistance to the convoy of Russian tanks that were trying to enter the city in late February, early March. And the residents were appealing with their bodies, with their posters, their signs. Some were trying to communicate to Ukrainian military authorities, the locale of the Russians. They were engaged in something of a stall because the plant was defended at that point by 70 members of the Ukrainian National Guard and were not equipped to face the Russian troops coming forward. If you look at this story on Wikipedia, they describe it as the Battle of Enerhodar. John and Charles especially, and myself, we found it as, a notable chapter, a notable episode of civilian resistance that needed more study, more examination. It wasn't wholly nonviolent, but it was, human beings using organically their means to avert troops, and remarkably, nobody was killed. Nobody was killed. And in that week of delay, there was later a fight with the National Guards. So John thought that this was a teaching moment in interviews. He would describe the Enerhodar chapter as a miracle, and one that could be recreated through people power by protecting the plant. Our final place was the town of Marganets, and I'm going back to that Google image because just so you can see where it is, it's here. This is on the northern bank of the river, and here's the plant. So we're about 10 kilometers from the front line, but we wanted to go there because we had a host whose life story is worthy of a novel. He was a former Soviet dissident. They're arranging for us to meet some of the townspeople, and this is our host, Oleg Solfyanek. I think I'm saying his name correctly. Marganets, or Marhanets, if you say it in Ukrainian, means magnesium. It's a mining town. It was also the locale of a German labor camp during the war. But it is now at half its population. That was once, I think, between 35 and 40,000. And here are members of the team, left to right, Peter Lumsdaine from Washington State, and Charles Johnson outside the apartment where John and Charles stayed for 3 nights. This was arranged through our contact, Oleg. And this is the landlord in the back. It was a rather bleak place, but more on that later. But it was where they positioned themselves or situated themselves, and lots of reliance on Google Translate. Here's talking to some of the local people. And that afternoon, for me, this was the most poignant. Our translator, Natalia, and driver showed us some of the sights of the town. And it was during that hour that I was reminded how a town, a dot on a Google map, becomes a place that people really love, that they really are attached to. And this is a pre-war image of the Palace of Culture. We were shown the soccer stadium, the new schools, and also Ostrovsky Park, which, because of decommunization, has now got a different, more boring name. And it's even in its ghostly version, which is what we saw, the place was lovely. And you could imagine young families being here at the fountain, at the Summer Theater, and how pleasant life, could be. And the trees were in bloom, and I had noted that. And Natalia said, "Oh yes, Marganets in the spring is full of trees. The horse chestnuts have blossoms like candles." And our driver Gennady, he added on, "Oh, we have everything here. We have vineyards, we have apricot trees, we have everything in Marganets." And these are the people the ones we met are those who chose to stay, to keep the town as their home. But it was a reminder that, when we think of destruction, it's often indistinctly, and to touch down into the lives of people and see what would be lost, for me at least, was very, very important. Probably the most affecting a period on the trip. So some final considerations on this, because I really went primarily as writer, as reporter. I'm not a key organizer on this effort, but this is one approach to bringing a possible cessation of hostilities. Maybe peace is too vast a word, in a multiplicity of approaches that the peace communities can use. And it's taking a discipline that's really evolving. This is a pragmatic nonviolence that's being attempted here with unarmed civilian protection. It's nonpartisan. It's focused on solving a practical problem, and consequently, people's opinions about the war, who's the greatest aggressor, its origin, are not quite as are as relevant. I don't think you can have people sitting at the table working on this problem who are militarists. The prerequisite is, not that you're pacifist or opposed to all war making. Another strength of this effort is that there is common agreement about the threat. Nobody disagrees that the plant would be a disaster if the plant melted down. So you have, and any negotiating effort, that's a big advancement if you have common agreement. Some of the challenges are obvious, is that the key players in this dilemma, US and Russia, have significant global influence and multiple motivations. Other arenas in which UCP has been applied, I think, I'm new to the field, the actors, the aggressors and perpetrators, or the two, the communities in discord are not such big players. They're very big players here, which makes the application of the strategy more complicated. There is high level of distrust between, even within Ukraine, from those who fled Enerhodar, those who stayed. So this is a factor. And of course, the very fluid battle dynamics that make the ground situation quite difficult, because there are checkpoints whether volunteers can get in or out is, a consideration. So what's next? So the project is preparing to send a team to Russian-controlled area. Charles has written a terrific report on findings from the April trip that I think will soon be available. The trainings of volunteers in UCP continue. Outreach continues, and if you want more information, it's here. But you really have the best people on this call, which would be Charles and John, and possibly Peter if he's here. And that is me at the mic, dear friends. And I've got to plug in my computer before it dies. But thank you. I will be there.
Thank you so much, Claire. We've talked about Zaporizhzhia as being a catastrophe waiting to happen. And yet you have put a very human touch to this all. So thank you very much. I don't see any questions in chat, so please, in the next number of minutes, please put any questions that you have in chat. But before we go to questions, we have two announcements that I'd like to leave some room for. In Mass Peace Action, we have most recently come up with 3 campaigns, 2 of which are absolutely relevant to the dangers of Zaporizhzhia. And I'd like to just take a minute for each. And let's see, Paul, Shannon, and Kathy Malley-Morrison, if you could each give us 1 minute of an update about your campaign.
Kathy, you want to go first?
Well, not particularly, but I will do it, do my best. Okay, so the Twin Threats campaign is against the 2 existential threats, nuclear weapons, and perhaps more generally, nuclear everything, nuclear power, and the environmental threat, which we see as closely related. Certainly the situation in Ukraine is a good example of the links between the environmental threat and the threat to life in the area of any place where there can be a nuclear explosion, and the related issue of waste. And of course, climate has had probably more recognition in recent years as an existential threat. Species are being wiped out daily because of drought, floods, etc. So our campaign is designed to educate people about the links between the 2 threats and try to build a more integrated movement so that we have one grand international movement which is fighting to recognize and address the 2 threats. I think that's it in a nutshell. We want to do education, we want to do rallies, we want to get mass protests against any further building of nuclear weapons and in favor of achieving total nuclear disarmament, and at the same time not losing track of all the related problems that we've already set going in our environments.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And if anybody is listening in Massachusetts and wants to get involved in the Twin Threats campaign, please get in touch with Kathy Malley-Morrison, Mass Peace Action. Paul.
Thank you. And thank you, Kathy. Just very quickly, there's no secret that there are many different points of view, let's say, on the Ukraine war. And our feeling at Mass Peace Action is that rather than trying to hit all of these disagreements head on, as important as education is, that perhaps as the war goes on and as people see what a devastating war it is, and as the danger of nuclear war increases, as the danger of more direct U.S. involvement increases by the day, that this is a time, whatever our differences with each other, this is a time when we can come together to make a loud public call for a ceasefire and negotiations as a much more promising future than continued war. And so the new MAPA Peace in Ukraine campaign will be focusing on building as much visible support for those 2 approaches, those 2 strategies, ceasefire and negotiations. We have an ad addressed to Zelensky, to Putin, to Biden, to please take the negotiation route rather than continued fighting. The main activity we're doing right now is collecting postcards, and we think that Claire is going to help us with that. And we've collected hundreds of postcards calling on our senators in Massachusetts and our representatives to do everything they can to raise high the banner of ceasefire and negotiations as opposed to continued escalation of the conflict. So that's the campaign. I'd ask any of you who are interested in the campaign to click on this link that I put here. It just means that you'd be willing to be kept informed of the campaign and willing to do your part. We'll be doing everything from social media to legislative work, public education, the whole ball of wax, in an attempt to mobilize as much sentiment as we can for negotiations in Ukraine and among the United States and Russia as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay, so these two campaigns are especially pertinent as we talk about Zaporizhzhia, as we see the kind of destruction that could happen in a protracted war, or if anything happened with that plant. So thank you both, Kathy and Paul. And Claire, do you have time for some questions? Maybe like 10 more minutes, or what's your time like?
All right. Yes, sure. And John and Charles are here, so they can also help. And I saw that Kathy Kelly is here. And but sure, yes, we'll do what we can.
Okay. In fact, Cole, if you want to bring on John and Charles and Kathy onto the screen and pin them, maybe Claire, you can decide who you would like to have answer these kinds of questions or share the answers.
Sure. Okay.
Paul, can we do that? That'd be great. All right. First question
Who is the Kathy that you're talking about? Sorry.
Kathy Kelly.
Kathy Kelly. Okay.
Yes. First question from Michael Eisenschur. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Did you speak with any members of the Russian minority population? How did their views of the conflict agree or differ from the responses by the Ukrainian majority members?
So I'm going to spin that over to John and Charles after myself, but we were in Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia, which are toward the eastern side of the country, where Russian is the majority of people that live there speak Russian. That's the dominant language of communication. So they're Ukrainian, but they're speaking in Russian, which in itself was a revelation to me. So we were speaking to them, but with our translator, and our translator himself was his parents were from Moscow, and he was born in Zaporizhzhia. So people's, unfortunately, war makes these identities just so terribly polarizing and brittle, and they aren't. People are moving in and out of, multiple identities. So in that sense, yes, we were speaking to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but the project is working on trying to send a team to the Ukrainians living in Russian-controlled area. So I don't know if John or Charles or Kathy, you want to say more on that?
And just to throw in responding to that question, another question is, are there any notes of understanding or analysis of the specific goals of Russian aggression in the area?
I'll just say a few words about talking to Russian speakers. Being on the Ukrainian side, there's not a lot of social freedom to speak about with sympathy to the Russian side, as is true in all populations supporting war on one side or the other. The one interview we had that was most relevant to what you're asking, though, was talking to a woman who lived in Enerhodar and was one of the witnesses to the amazing story that happened there. And after a month or so of Russian occupation, they were allowed to leave if they wanted. And she told us that about 2/3 of the people left. A full third stayed, preferring to keep their houses under Russian occupation than to lose them and go to the Ukrainian side. So they had a lot of disagreements, and she said they don't even talk anymore because they see each other as wrong, and that's really the reason for us wanting to go to the other side now, to hear all the stories of the other side. And I think one of the things that would make this project work, if it comes about, is reconciling, or at least getting these people, like these two women, and there are lots of people with friends and relatives on opposite sides of the line, to get them to put away, at least for a while, their terrible disagreements about who should rule their country and who's the aggressor, and talk about their mutual interest in safety of the plant. I think that's one of the big draws here.
Yeah, and I would just add that those we spoke with who had evacuated from what is now the Russian-held area, they are choosing that they want to be in Ukrainian-held areas. But like John said, they had indicated that like a third of that town and Hodar, in fact, they even said a third of the town was happy that the Russian forces arrived. And some people maybe stayed because they had no better option. They couldn't easily move, and they didn't want to lose all their possessions. But other people, it seemed, may have stayed because of maybe different loyalties. And it seemed like we got a picture that there are people who in these areas of the Southeast who are pro-Ukrainian. There are those who are pro-Russian, perhaps, and maybe those who are pro-autonomy, maybe neither wanting to be necessarily Ukrainian or Russian, but sort of having our autonomy. So we got a lot of complexity, I think, even in the small sample size of people that we spoke with. But we were only speaking to people who were on the Ukrainian held side. And so there was a limitation in the perspective that we got. And so that's why we're continuing with exploring other areas.
And as far as the question of Russian motivation, we did not speak with anybody who would give us the Russian viewpoint on that. Having watched this war very closely, it seems pretty obvious to me that the nuclear power plant is Putin's single biggest prize to catch in this conflict for many reasons. It's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, second largest in the world, I believe. And not only is it a trophy for war, but it actually has the capacity to serve 10 million people. So it's really worth a lot economically, monetarily to the Russian Republic.
Okay, now for some reason I got bumped out of this program, but I quickly came back in. But it seems like I lost all of the chat. So I don't have the whole history of chat, and I know that there were some other questions, and I think so. Cole, maybe you can look at the chat. Either there's some question about about the waste.
Give me 1 second. I'll see what I can do. I'm trying to get you back on screen.
Technology.
Yeah, I saw a question about nuclear waste. Is it similar to U.S. power plants? And I'm far from an expert on that, but I have read a lot, and we've had nuclear plant operators talk to us, and actually my brother ran a nuclear power plant. So unlike Chernobyl, which was an old Soviet style, not very safe design, this power plant is very much on par with most Western nuclear power plants. And it's got 37 years of nuclear waste stored there, which is similar to all fission reactors of this type. And so, yes, it's what sits there is very, very similar. I think it's really poignant. Claire pointed out in one of the slides, our friend Oleg Bodrov, who was on a webinar just the other night here, his calculations of how much plutonium there is unbelievable. I haven't seen that either disputed or confirmed anywhere else. But 500,000 times Hiroshima is literally what it could possibly be. But it's highly unlikely that that would ever get spread around. That would have to be your mission to spread it around. You would have to put explosives under all the waste pools, under all the dry caskets, under all the reactors to actually aerosolize that much plutonium. It would almost take a nuclear weapon over the plant to release that much radiation.
So if there are any nuclear technical people, correct me, but a new detail that I learned, I neglected to say in the presentation that the people in the area of ZNPP, they're very proud of that plant because it is quite modern, and they understood it as being very well reinforced. And I think the popular perception in mine too certainly was that, oh, the towers and the structure is built to withstand heavy bombardment. An engineering friend who attended a talk on this topic that I gave the other night, he said the problem with the waste is that that are kept in the pools of water, they are kept in equidistance, those spent rods, and they need to be, because they're buzzing, and if they come too close to one another, if the water goes down, because the water's sort of maintaining the equilibrium as well as the coolness, then you have the fire and the burning. And the areas where that waste is held, contained, is not as well reinforced, I don't think, as the towers. I could be wrong, but this gentleman at the talk said, even in Massachusetts, we have our nuclear waste stored in very vulnerable structures. So there is a point of comparison for us, which I was like, hey, why don't we insist for our own protection? But the second point that the IAEA keeps, panicking about is the power lines that maintain the cooling system are continually jeopardized by military action, because they're getting degraded, and then they have to go on to backup generators, and that is very, very, very precarious. So I think those are some of the more vulnerable points in the structure of the facility.
And again, all of your work and putting this very human face on this incredibly dangerous situation. I want to go to a question here. Did you hear any thoughts from Ukrainians about a ceasefire, negotiations, or desire for the end of fighting?
That was certainly a question that one member of our team who's not here, Peter, asked a number of people. He was curious about receptivity to ceasefire. My general impression is not a whole lot of openness among the Ukrainians that we interviewed. There's the war dynamic as they perceived it was that our homeland has been violated. We need to push them back to the border with Russia. That's all. Then that's all we want. The views were more complicated concerning the plant itself, that yes, that was a problem that had to be dealt with through negotiation, because any military means wouldn't work. So that is my recollection. I do want to offer this point of comparison to sort of influence thinking or perception of this approach. The Colorado River is drying up in the United States, which is very critical for us. And the people in that area are, if you're categorizing them politically, they're red and blue and, maybe red. I recently heard an interview with some of those farmers who are tagged as red. And at the end of the day, it's less relevant when you're trying to solve the problem of the river. because whether you're red or blue farmer, you have to have water. And so part of this approach, at least as I understand it, is one's analysis of the war. It certainly influences perhaps level of engagement, but it doesn't have to, because the issue is so practical. It's basically we don't want to be radiated and have generational destruction of the ecosystem. So I don't know if the others, Charles or John, but it's a very technical kind of focus. I think as peacemakers, we're often focused on, you know, who like an analysis or a solution on paper that we can't fit all the squares, you know, we can't make it all fit. And in this equation or this dilemma, it's a bit like your mom after the glass is on the kitchen floor. It's irrelevant after who broke the glass. We all need to walk on the floor. So figure out how to clean it up, because we need that floor. So it's a bit of that. I think that's one reason I resonate with it, having a bunch of kids and just appreciating that the theoretical doesn't get us to the clean fit kitchen floor quickly.
I'd just like to pose this question. At some point during your presentation, you showed us this map and you talked about the plume, and we see the position of Zaporizhzhia relating to the rest of Europe. So this is a much wider problem, an international problem. To what extent do you think that the UN can do anything more in terms of going for a wider zone? Did that come up in conversation? Throwing that out.
Charles, I'm passing it to you all, Charles or John, or we have John Fairfield here too, who's on the steering committee, people watching this. So if you all want to take that.
John, you're muted.
The International Atomic Energy Agency was the people that negotiated this and came up with the idea. And our initial thought was those of us who have experience in unarmed protections in various conflicts could add something in terms of supporting them. And my original idea is we could send 3 or 4 protectors just to shadow those guys so that we could let them know that somebody's looking out for them, that they wouldn't just be arbitrarily arrested or hurt by forces on site of the plant and so forth. So we spent months trying to find volunteers who could do that. And by the time we got about 40 volunteers, I said, that's enough. We went to the International Atomic Energy Agency, who actually assured us that these were not naive technicians, but had all been people that had been working in nuclear power plants that had other social problems around them. So for example, in Ethiopia and so forth, and that they felt reasonably comfortable there. And that if the high-level negotiations produced the 30-kilometer circle around the nuclear power plants as a safety zone, the UN would have plenty of resources to staff that, because it would take many hundreds of people to monitor that zone. So they have not been able to accomplish that. So the emphasis now is to help civil society, who are the ones who are going to be hurt the most, push for that and figure out how, one, they can help get that zone established, and if it comes about, help maintain it with additional people. Because the one thing the UN, and I don't want to say this as a blanket statement, but they have a lot more experience in armed peacekeeping methods that have limitations of arms, and arms are the problem around this nuclear power plant, and perhaps less in what we could offer, and that is looking out for the rumors, the manipulation of the civilian population, keeping an eye on everybody around the plant who could be used to sabotage or to somehow sabotage the safety of the plant by letting everybody be a stakeholder. In other words, like people told us how bitterly disappointed they were when the Ukrainian army did not defend the plant, and they felt betrayed. And that gave them a sense of maybe we need to do a few things on our own. And adding to that safety zone, I think, would add a lot to the stability of any kind of safety zone.
Okay, just one last question, and I'll put two together. This seems to be like, on the future of what is happening. Oh, I'm sorry, Charles, you had your hand up. Did you want to throw in an answer to that last question?
Yeah, just real quick. Sorry.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah, I think, we had heard from people that skepticism about the inspectors' effectiveness, people feeling, oh, inspectors are there, but they're not very effective because we're still getting shelled or things like that. But that makes us more curious, like, oh, how many inspectors would it take for them to be more effective? How many people would it take to be in a leading a safety zone? But people also saw the miraculous side that, okay, these nonpartisan inspectors are there. And so I think there's a lot of possibility that, when you think outside the box, people often responded, well, yeah, that's true. Actually, it's kind of surprising that people have gotten in there, and what would it take to make it more effective? And just another real quick note is that, to my recollection, I think a lot of people actually were open to a ceasefire or open to something different than war, because a lot of people who said we're already more than a year into this war, is the Ukrainian military advancing? Is that going to lead to something good, or is Russia going to then, respond to that? And I think a lot of, at least from what I gathered, there were as many people interested in either ceasefire or we got to do something different. I don't know what it is. A lot of people said, I don't know how this war will end. There were certainly a lot of people who said we need a military victory, but I felt there were also a lot of people who thought we have to do something different, or we need a ceasefire, or we need to we just need this to stop, no matter what it takes. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm looking at our time. It's 1:15. Thank you so much for spending extra time. There's some wonderful questions in the chat, and I'm wondering if people can throw their questions to you, sending you an email. Is that possible? Claire?
I'm not the best woman for the job, so if I don't know if John or anybody from the steering committee wants to put their name on. And Joseph Gerson, I'm seeing your question, and maybe
Yes.
I'll just try to answer it when you and I talk. But
go for that.
Yeah, I think I'm not the central person on this story. So if John or Charles or John Fairfield or Kathy, or they could take those questions. The website provided on screen, probably we should put that in the chat if people want more information on the project. Is that the best way to
Surely
do that? And I don't know, Charles, how you feel if a recording is sent, if the report that you created if you're ready to share it, or you want to wait, or you can think about that. But that's another, okay. Yeah, that's another sort of summary that people could use. So there we go. John Fairfield, who's been involved on this project from the beginning, is giving his email. That's JHN, and John Brewer is putting it up. So please do check with them on on this project. Yeah, I think in closing, this is an extremely challenging reality, like the whole war itself. And the one nonviolent strategy used throughout time has been public pressure and spotlight. And I think that is needed here. So in our own corners, to continually spotlight the fate of the plant and the living beings in its environs is perhaps one way to indirectly keep the situation from, drastically deteriorating. So any communities where that can be done, but I think a lot. Any
Right.
closing remarks from other folks?
I'd just like to say, going back to this book, nothing is impossible. And so peace is possible, negotiations are possible. So thank you all very much. And again, a YouTube will be sent to, a follow-up will be sent to everybody who registered with the YouTube video, and any other bits of information you would like to put in there. And if you would like, we can put in your email contacts, if that's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation and really for the work that you did, for the very humane and peaceful work. Thank you.